I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today we're discussing Book 1, Chapter 6, Section 2, Wealth Tastes Good. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny and Ryan Ahn. Hello, Pat. Hello, Ryan.
Hey, Jason.
Hello.
My first question, do individuals adopt the preferences of their parents or teachers?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like that's an easy one. I feel like you're throwing a softball at me, but I think at least initially, certainly you adopt the preferences of those who are around you. Growing up, that's mostly your parents. I would say as time moves on, as you meet more people, as your social circle becomes a bigger part of your life, you start to adopt other preferences around you. But I would say certainly some preferences from your childhood will stick with you. Others you grow out of, and then others you discover on your own. So it's not like it's a 100% what your parents like you like, but I think there'll be one or two things that might stick with you throughout life. And maybe that's a nostalgia factor, or maybe it's just that you got that preference from your parents and you stick with it.
In that answer, you ignore the entire set of places, items, things, concepts that individuals will say is that it's old, that's stodgy. Those are things that of our parents' generation, of prior generations. So we can say, yes, of course, we adopt some of the preferences of our parents or teachers, but we don't adopt all of them. So what is it that determines whether a preference is adopted or whether a preference is left behind?
Probably largely peer driven, right? And the extent to which that peer group accepts or rejects those things, those flavors, those products, those ideas. So, the preferences of your parents or of teachers is almost like a naive prior. And as your peer group and the context around you changes or rejects certain ideas or adopts new ones, you'll go with that.
But I was a statistician.
Or you'll be like Jason and you'll drive your own preferences forward.
Can you describe a time that a teacher or a parent changed your preferences?
So yeah, I can remember a very low stakes example. I really didn't like coconut as a kid, and I don't remember the name of the candy. I think it's Mounds, but my dad really loved Mounds, and I knew it had coconut, so I didn't want to try it. And the first time I tried it, I instantly loved it. Obviously, it's candy, right? So it's not like I loved coconut right off the bat, but it was something that kind of started a gateway, which allowed me to then explore more coconut flavors, and now I love coconut. But that's just one very low stakes example. I can certainly think of other times in my life where you, Jason, have changed my preferences. Additionally, we all share some tea teachers in common. And I've been shown time and time again when I had a strong preference, particularly, I'm trying to think of a very specific example. I had a very strong aversion early on to jincha. And we had a teacher that provided us an example in a lesson of a very high quality jincha, which changed my mind. And it's not something I still particularly buy a lot of, but just gave me a reference point that showed me that my preference was formed a little early, right, and prematurely, and that there were examples that could go against the grain and show me why that could be something that could be a positive preference.
To give a very specific tea example as well, I remember, and I think we've talked about this before, but I think this experience, we had two different sets of experiences that changed our mind on Lapsang Souchong. For the longest time, I thought that I didn't like it, and then a teacher that we all have in common brought one to Penn State, really high-end example, and he brewed it in a Zisha teapot without a lid. And that was just, it happened to be missing a lid. So I was really skeptical of this whole setup. One, it was a tea I thought I didn't like. and it was being brewed in a teapot without a lid. And it was just incredible. It totally reframed my expectations for what that tea could be. The flavors, the balance, is just incredible. It's the total opposite of a smoke bomb. It was so sweet and so subtle, and it was so perfect in so many ways, and just blew my expectations out of the water.
I have a similar example. I had a previous strong aversion to the log-shaped Yixing teapots. I saw them as kitschy and as looked too much like playthings. But I had some really wonderful tea brewed out of a high-end ROC example of one of the log pots that was predominantly Zisha with a bit of Duani in order to get the coloration right. Beautiful craftsmanship, really high-end, great production of tea coming out, perfect shape and size, and just very high levels of artistic skill on the Yixing. So that certainly changed my preferences.
So, Jason, this brings me to a little bit of a question that I have around preferences. When you speak about your negative preference or your negative perceptions around the log-shaped teapot, how strongly do you feel like you held on to that preference?
That is a great question. I try to, this is becoming more personal than authorship, right? But I try to live or hold strong opinions loosely held. I don't always match that, but preferences are what make individuals interesting. Preferences are what allow you to move about the world with meaning or insight, right? This idea of either aloofness or disinterest or disengagement or indifference is very much a shield that individuals use to blunt the forces of the world acting upon them and to blunt their own, to avoid the need to take their own autonomy in their interactions with the world. And so, that's not to say that strong opinions are always good, right? But strong opinions are a way to set your flag somewhere, and then to be willing to move it when proven right or proven wrong. So strong opinions loosely held. I will come to strong opinions, and I'm very open to them being challenged or changed or modified as experiences continue to come in. Really as a true Bayesian.
So I really like that quote, and I think you had said that quote to me quite early on when we first met, and something that has stuck with me. But I asked that because you open up the chapter with a quote from Max Planck, right, stating that essentially opposition to innovation, right, isn't won over. Opposition dies out and allows innovation to move forward with the next generation. And the chapter goes on to state that preference, like science, progresses one funeral at a time. I think that's your exact sentence. With each passing generation, right? And my perspective was that most individuals hold beliefs in science, religion, quite dogmatically, versus hobbies or casual entertainment, food, etc., which you might hold quite more loosely compared to religion. You might be able to, I might be able to tell you or convince you to drop red meat for a month, but I don't think I'm going to debate a Hasidic Jew into atheism. How do we feel that dogmatism impacts the average practitioner in tea ceremony? How might one being attached to their preferences either help or be an impediment to one progressing within the praxis?
At the individual level, I believe that the causality flows the opposite way. You have individuals, some of which are going to have dogmatic opinions, some of which are going to have loose opinions, some of which are going to have opinions that willingly or unwillingly change over time. They are not the root cause of the necessity of the evolution or revolution between generations in the opinions that govern the outcomes of the praxis. It is really at the production level, the individuals who are producing yixings, what type of styles do they believe are preferred? What type of styles are individuals going to buy? The individual tea farmers that are producing tea. Do individuals want to drink it now, red into pu'er, or do they want strong, brutally bitter pu'er that needs to wait 10 years? So those types of progressions are much slower to change because it's not about any one individuals, it's about the convergence of preference, the alignment of preference in which to create that will succeed in a market economy. And so I think that there are individuals out there that are making great tea. There are individuals out there that are innovating and making great tea and wares. There are individuals out there that are open to the innovation in new tea and wares. But there are also individuals that are not. There are a lot of individuals we would class as traditionalists, some of whom are more or less knowledgeable or more or less traditional than they believe. A lot of the traditionalism that exists in Chinese tea ceremony does not date back that far. There's going to be an example in the next book, which is many months in the future, I hope. Still working on it, but there's going to be an example, right? What do you think is older, thermoses and the thermos company, or Taiwanese High Mountain Oolong? Thermoses, right? What do you think is older, thermoses or what's another good example? Or Jinjinmei, right? Obviously thermoses. What do you think is older, thermoses or contemporary or show pu'er, right? Thermoses. These things that we think are traditional and not traditional, right? Thermos brewing is older than many of the types of teas we consider classical teas. So that is all to say, it is about the alignment. It is about the convergence of preferences, and it is about what is going to succeed in contemporary society governed by contemporary preferences. And you have individuals on all sides of that are pushing the boundary. But as an individual, I do believe that you should have strong opinions, loosely held.
So I think I like where that tangent took us. And I just asked the question because I think of myself as a practitioner, and I like to step back and look at, my practice. And I find that sometimes my preference leads to biases. And I find that I go a long time without challenging them at times and see how it can impede my progress. And so I wanted to put that question out there and see if you guys felt that you've ever had the same experience. I'm sure many practitioners feel the same way.
Taking back control of the conversation, we were just discussing the effects of the market economy. How has capitalism changed the practice of Chinese tea?
I think it would be more accurate to ask how hasn't capitalism, shaped the tea practice or shaped tea as it's spread throughout the world. So, we can look back as far as the Silk Road, right, and see how, brick tea was transported through northern China, across borders, making its way all the way out to the Middle East. And, we can skip many centuries and see how the tea trade with, Europeans, the East meeting West, has shaped many economies, driven wars, maybe taken a lot of silver out of certain companies' coffers or entire nations' coffers. But when we look at just the modern day, those with capital are able to drive changes quite easier, I would say, than those without, because they have the money to throw around to say, this is what I like, this is what I want, these are my preferences. I need you, whether that's a workshop, a craftsman, et cetera, a tea farmer. I need you to meet these preferences that I want, and I have the money to make it happen. So certainly, a system which is driven by wealth, like capitalism, those who have the wealth can drive the changes that they want.
So you argue that tea has always existed in a market economy, yet tea practitioners generally, we're very interested, and some of us maybe even obsessed about what happened in the Imperial Palace. Did the Imperial Palace exist in a market economy, or was that something different?
I would say that that's something different. It's a patronage model, where things were either directly commissioned or maybe it was tribute. So in that case, the power was very concentrated. So I would say it's not a market, or it's a market of one.
Right. It's not the economic capital in that scenario that's really driving forward, right? The changes in wares, artistic taste, etc. It's the power of being the emperor, right? That's the ultimate social and cultural capital right there. So if you want something done, you're going to have it done, and what you fancy at the time is what's going to be in vogue. So it's quite a powerful position to be in, very literally.
But the choices, the desires, the styles, and preferences of the emperor did have financial and economic ramifications through the rest of Chinese society, did it not? So where do we draw this line between the patronage system, or things being produced in the Imperial Palace Workshop, and seeing those things appear in a market economy, right? What is the linkage there?
Well, I think when you have an individual such as the emperor with such a massive cachet, right? Others will always aspire to have, I think, what the pinnacle of having, being the emperor. Others will aspire for what the emperor has. I think it doesn't matter what title or position that is, whether it's the emperor, the shogun, the president, etc. People are going to want what the super ultra rich, whether that's in capital or in social capital, have. So, I think if you're a tea practitioner at the time, let's say, during Qianlong's time, and you see his, stemmed cups, you are gonna, if you're, let's say, in the palace as a noble, you see that, that's in preference with the emperor. The emperor has impeccable taste. You're not going to question that. So you want it too, because it's a signal that you also have good taste, and it's showcasing something about your own, cultural knowledge, your own cultural capital. So in that point, I would say that, once we're looking outside the N of one, that is the emperor and the palace, it does become capitalism once again that is driving the market. It is a trend, right, that others see. They're trying to follow in these high capital ideals, and thus they have to use their economic capital to drive forward the changes they want to see, the wares they want, to meet the preferences that either they themselves have or that have been formed for them.
For historical accuracy and clarification, there is ongoing scholarly debate over whether or not China can be considered capitalist as far back as the Song, maybe even Tang dynasty. It is apparent that it was a market economy, whether or not it was a creator of industry, the industry which was able to develop and preserve capital, taking on capital from outside sources, and then to deploy that capital into higher activities of ROI, is an area under original debate. At one point, it was believed that China did not arise capitalism because even though it had markets, it had no technological advancement in the things of science and technologies, and never developed a structure for investment into private industry. More recent research has shown that that is not true, that in fact, mining taking place in the far provinces was invested in by individuals, literatis and other elites, sometimes government individuals, investing their own money, their own capital into those projects and seeing an ROI on those investments. Now some of the continued debates center on whether or not there was ongoing technological advancement within the industries, or whether it was simple taking on of capital, using it to deploy labor, and then distributing the profits. So that is an interesting area. But in any case, it doesn't negate anything that Pat said. That is an area of open debate. And it was clear that it was a market economy. The next question, how does economic capital change the availability of an education in tea?
Certainly access, what you can and cannot afford, to some degree. It's probably the biggest one, at least in modern days, is just access of what you what you can pay for.
Right. I would definitely agree. I think, being able to try benchmark samples of golden standard products. So being able to try Hong Yin, being able to try Lu Yin, right? These are things that you need money for. But additionally, things like physically touching, right? ROC Yixing, or touching, Qing Dynasty Yixing, Song Dynasty ceramics. These are things that, require money, because you can go see them at a museum for a pretty good price. But I think a lot of the education comes from physically getting your hands on it, even better if you can actually use it or taste tea out of it. Another way that I think education impacts, one's journey within the tea praxis is that, having economic capital allows you access, I think, to higher degrees of education. So I think you can, it does cost money, right, to study under teachers. And some of the best teachers charge a very high price. And the thing that I think really is the crux of education is that it dramatically reduces the amount of time needed to go from theory or just knowledge, right, into actual application or practice of these techniques. So, just like with human civilization and mathematics, right? Different human civilizations took centuries to millennia to develop advanced maths like algebra or calculus. But, kids can learn it now in a decade in school. And you can be at the forefront of the mathematics frontier in 2 decades of school and a little postdoc work. The same can be said of tea. You can be on an island all alone, and it doesn't matter what your economic capital is. You can try and teach yourself tea ceremony. You're probably not going to get as far as someone who can spend a couple $100s on lessons in a year or two, and have a teacher teach them what they should learn.
Where do we see class differences in the preferences for tea, both outside the praxis in the broader tea world? Someone says, "I love tea," but they're talking about Earl Grey. Or within the praxis, what do we see as the class differences for preferences?
Well, at the commercial scale, probably differences between things like loose leaf tea and tea bags. It's an easy one, where loose leaf tea is more sought after, higher form of practice, more. It signals more that you can afford it and that you know what's good. Within the practice, it's really hard to say, actually, because it depends on whether or not you take sort of the Western tea people that have dived into Chinese tea ceremony, and I would say that their preferences are probably pretty different. Class distinction and preferences are probably fairly different than that in Taiwan or mainland or Hong Kong. Just based on, local preferences there.
Right. I think that's a good point. I think, certainly you do see and or feel a difference, right? When you see someone posting, let's say, pu'er cakes that cost $40 very consistently versus when you see someone on Instagram posting, pu'er cakes that cost upwards of $500. So you can very quickly see a class distinction there as far as economic capital. But within that medium, right, it's much harder to actually see the preferences in action beyond how much money they cost. You don't really truly know why any of those individuals buy or prefer what they buy, other than potentially the cost distinction. As far as actually coming into contact with other practitioners, you certainly can tell based on the wares they select. Obviously conversation is going to be the number one way to tell class distinction, but I would say tea in some ways is a great equalizer. You can come from any background, and at some point your preferences can converge. So in the other way, it can also really showcase class distinction, I think, in the wares or teas that you personally have available when you're comparing one person's let's say stash of tea to another's. So it's a little bit of both, in that sometimes it's very hard to tell and sometimes it's right in front of your face.
I mean, but just pushing on that or pulling on that thread a little bit, what is class distinction within, let's say, the Western tea community? Like, it is hard to tell. I feel like I don't have a very good mental model of what is a, quote, high class person that practices Chinese tea ceremony in the West. I don't have a good model for that. And what is a low class? I mean, you could argue that people who have true yixings, they're using chabus, beautiful setups, like nice tetsubin, antique wares, really expensive tea. But you know, people who are using tea tables and they don't clean their teaware and everything looks kind of gross, right, is low class. But it's not, other elements of it don't feel that cut and dry, because I feel like in the West there's not a lot of tea people that actually interact with one another, and there's something about the interaction and the you know, the two groups interacting with each other, that where you can really feel and build a mental model for those distinctions. Because you can also have people that just have a ton of money, buy all this nice stuff, create a beautiful setup, but maybe they really don't know anything about tea.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Ryan. And, you know, just to build on that, maybe it's because we both come from, you know, working class Pennsylvania backgrounds, but, you know, maybe it's hard for us to tell, right? Maybe from the other side, it's much easier to tell when you're having tea with people who are, you know, maybe a little bit low class. Maybe the high class people can tell us, you know, a little bit more about it. But no, I totally agree with you. When there's not an in-person interaction, how can you tell really from someone's Facebook or Instagram post? It's just, you know, curated to look the way they want it to look. You really can't tell. They are, you know, either just showing what their own preferences, you know, completely cleanly, this is what I like, or they are trying to signal or showcase some higher cultural capital ideal, and whether they're hitting the mark or missing the mark would be the only way to really tell, you know, which group they fall within.
Yeah, what does that structure look like in an internet age where there's this veil and all that you see is what you want people to see, and there's very little interaction? It's very different, and I don't think we have a good model for thinking through that, at least in Western Chinese tea ceremony, tea communities.
For the benefit of our listeners, I'll remind everyone, when in doubt, pinky out.
And also for the benefit of our listeners, we're just pulling on this thread. You know, Jason's asking us some great questions, trying not to venture into the field of elitism, but just trying to really think of how does, you know, these cultural differences, how do they impact, you know, our practice?
Well, particularly because many of the individuals who practice tea in China were from the literatis or the elites. Now, many of the individuals that practice tea in China or that we are interacting with are craftsmen, individuals who are making yixings, who are making tea. Suddenly, with the internet, they have a voice in an area, in a tradition, in a praxis where they've never had a voice before. And for the most part, when you look at historical China, the craftsmen did not practice tea. Individuals who made yixing didn't really drink tea. Individuals who grew tea frequently couldn't afford the tea they were growing. They had to sell it to feed their family, and they would drink farmer tea, right? Lightly processed, nearly unprocessed green teas, or depending on where they were, green or black teas. So the idea now of what is high class, right? What are the class distinctions? Would we consider someone who makes beautiful yixings, who is now considered not just an art craftsman but an artist? Would we consider them high class if they were to brew tea poorly in their beautiful yixings that they made? Would we consider them high class? These are questions about what is culture, what is the foundation, what is the fundamental elements of the culture. Because if you can't make a distinction between what is high and what is low, right, then is there a culture of distinction? Is there a culture is there a cultural hierarchy? And maybe it is okay in situations where there is not, where the culture is still being formed. As Ryan said, we don't know what exactly is the differentiating factor in high class in Western tea practice, because so much Western tea practice is new, and where it used to trail and follow the original Chinese tea practice, now it has almost ventured off. Because of things we've mentioned many times on this podcast, tea hermits, individuals buying from Western-focused, Western-facing vendors who are making things that Western people like because that's what they'll buy it, right? And so it might be that the culture is too young to tell that difference, and it hasn't developed the stratification, hasn't developed this hierarchy. Or maybe not. Maybe all that it takes to be high class is to have a Tetsuba and a silver teapot. I don't know.
In many ways, you could make the argument that the internet is the great equalizer, actually, because those class distinctions in other fields are eroding. Right now, it was possible. Let's say at the Tea Institute at Penn State, right? You could have someone coming from any background, doesn't know anything about tea, just knows that they're vaguely interested in it, go through this transformation with all these formative experiences and knowledge and context and tastings and events and even opportunities to teach again what they had learned, right? You can take someone who is, doesn't come from any of that background to be able to speak and talk about tea with tea masters in Asia and tea experts, and can hold a real conversation and have deep preferences, and it doesn't require that economic capital in some circumstances. And as more of those resources and knowledge and context and access gets put online, it erodes what are traditionally thought of as the conditions needed to create those class distinctions. So Jason, you wrote the arts of the bourgeois will remain with the bourgeois because they have the formative experiences in which to appreciate them. But what if you can get access to those experiences, and that economic capital or social capital are no longer barriers? That means anyone can do it. So to me, that speaks people who are willing to go through that journey in the discipline of learning, right? It turns it much more into a merit-based set of class distinctions.
Yeah, I would add, just kind of following on that thread, this is probably something our listeners would be interested in, a question I'm interested in. How can those without the monetary capital of our, theoretical wealthy individual, right, from this chapter, hope to obtain the same quality or volume of experiences as those with high capital? And I think Ryan was kind of touching upon it. But Jason, outside of a, let's say, center for education, specifically on tea, how would one without the capital go about trying to obtain these experiences or this learning?
Oh, I don't know. If I knew, I would do something other than write a book. I've said many times that I'm very skeptical of online communities or communities that don't have a physical presence. I think that without the physical presence, without the experience of holding and touching and tasting, I have no idea how else an individual would do it. Form a group, form a center, gather a group of like-minded individuals, and pool your resources, and you can afford many things that you could not afford alone. That is a methodology that has worked consistently throughout history, and I don't see any difference in I don't see any differences that would enable a different methodology to work better today.
And I think maybe just to finish off on our discussion of high and low class distinction within the practice, we're speaking primarily here from the literati class, where Jason, you had mentioned, right? Historically, there was always a class distinction, which was quite clear. But I would say, just in whole, in the totality of tea as a practice, tea itself can be quite a great equalizer with a lot of its roots, in Buddhist and Taoist teachings. So in many ways, a lot of tea practices can really separate themselves from class distinction. So why is it important that here in the literati tradition, we are able to make these kind of distinctions, and why are these distinctions important?
That's a great question. One that I hope is answered in the next chapter.
Sounds like this is a good cliffhanger that we'll leave off here.
One other line of questioning that I think is quite interesting is moving to not just the individuals themselves, but the question about the tea, right? There's many discussions online over whether tea needs to be a certain price before it can be considered worth appreciation. So I'm going to start off on a strange track, but it will come around to this. How do you personally differentiate what is good tea?
It's a great question. And so for me, at this point in my tea journey, a little over 10 years, I've certainly tasted well over, I would say, at least 10,000 teas. I've probably spent close to that many hours tasting tea. And with that experience comes a reference, right? A personal mental guidebook that I can go to. And so a lot of it for me comes down to one, can I afford it? So is it within, my budget for the year on tea? I do budget. And then two, once I've tasted it, so I'm always going to buy a sample first. Once I've tasted it, does it meet the qualities that I'm looking for within a tea? A tea doesn't always have to check every box, but there should be some boxes that it's checking. And for me, a lot of those are mouthfeel. So, is it coating my throat? Does it hit the upper palate? Does it feel comfortable in my mouth? How is the flavor? And the flavor is not always the most important for me. But what is the lingering, aroma that, reaches up to the nasal cavities? What's the retronasal olfaction like? And then, of course, what are the body effects like? What's the chi like? That's probably actually the least important to me, but it certainly can be a symbol of quality for tea. And so there's certainly a mental checklist I go through when I'm tasting to see if this fits the price to quality ratio I'm looking for in teas that I'm purchasing. So sometimes I'll buy a tea that's just okay, but I know it's just okay. And I know I'm paying a fair price for it. And it's just going to be a drinker. And then sometimes I'm going to spend upwards of the maximum of my budget to buy something that's really special. And it's not special just because it's expensive, but I've tasted it and I know that it has qualities that I like and that I prefer. And that signal to me something important about that class of tea.
Ryan, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, one thing that is a really important consideration to me is the lifespan of the tea itself after you buy it. So, as we all purchase more and more tea, I don't know about you guys, but my collection's getting to the point where it's beyond the amount that I can reasonably drink over a very long period of time. I think I calculated I could drink 2 Gaiwan's worth of pu'er a day for like 12 years. So now when I buy new tea, I need to think, how quickly am I going to move through it? And how is this tea itself going to change? And do I have the right storage conditions for it? Like this year, for example, I bought way too much green tea. There's no way that I'm moving through that green tea fast enough that I can enjoy it properly. So that has been my number one consideration is ageability. And if it's a tea that can't age or doesn't improve with age, I just buy a very small amount, enjoy it while I have it, and then it's gone.
I do have some good news for you. I've looked at the actuarial tables and you have more than 12 years left. So you can continue buying.
So I think that is a really good consideration, though, Ryan. I'm up against the same spatial considerations. So luckily, recently I moved and I have a lot more physical space to store my tea. But I do have a Pomodoro. It has very nice storage conditions. I've had it for just about 5 years, and I've seen nice transformations in my tea. But it's totally full, and I'm kind of rationalizing to myself. When do I decide to buy another Pomodoro? When does my wife let me get another Pomodoro? How much tea is too much, right? So I've certainly got something like 60 or 80 pu'er cakes in there. And I think I'm just at the point where I have to decide to buy better and buy less. Or, if I see some really good paychecks come my way in the next couple of years, then maybe I just get another Pomodoro and just keep stashing it.
Quite the flex. Now, my next question is, what is an example of an expensive tea that tastes bad when brewed poorly?
I think an easy example is, I would say the early 2000s Dai cakes that everyone's freaking out about recently. 7542 from like 03 onwards, depending on the storage, can taste really terrible depending on how you brew it. And I would say a lot of the Shagwans, right? Like a lot of your mid 2000s Shagwans are just a punch in the throat if you don't brew it well, or if you're not really paying attention to how you brew it, right? Those are teas that turn sour really easy, that are very astringent, very bitter. And if that's what you like, that's fine. But there are ways to modulate your brewing to make those teas taste better. I think as you get to the earlier 2000s and then the late 90s, depending on the storage, a lot of those have smoothed out pretty decently. A lot of Luyin, right? So 90, 75, 42. You don't have to brew it with the most attention. You should, because it's expensive, but it's harder to mess that up. I think teas that still quite have a lot of life and punch can be very easily ruined.
Now, is a good tea still good tea when brewed poorly?
Well, that brew of tea is bad, but the tea in and of itself, the innate tea, is still a good tea. It just you brewed it bad.
Do you agree with that, Ryan?
I think the end product is what matters. Tea is an unfinished good, which is why gongfu is required. So even if you have the best tea brewed poorly, the tea is no good because the brewer is no good.
Right, but what if that brewer then gives let's just give me way too much praise in this this blog or this podcast. Let's give me too much praise in this podcast. What if that brewer then hands the tea to me and I brew it well, decently, and you have a nice cup of tea? Did that tea that was not good and tasted bad previously just become a good tea because I brewed it?
Well, it depends on what you think of as tea. So if the unit is the finished product, then the finished product was good. If you're calling tea dry leaves, and that's the tea, then it depends. There is variable quality depending on its end state.
This question will eventually lead us to why is good tea priced high or why is bad tea priced low? Really, the question is, what are qualities that are intrinsic to the tea, right? What are the innate qualities of the tea? If we have large-scale agreements that the dye use are good, but take skill to brew, is that worth more or less than a lesser tea?
So my personal take on this, and maybe it's because of the tradition that we're within, I don't think the difficulty of the tea should impact difficulty in brewing the tea should impact its value. I think that the tea should be priced according to its intrinsic qualities known by the farmer or the tea buyer, right? The person who's sourcing or curating this tea. Hopefully that person knows how to brew the tea in some way that showcases the good qualities of it. But for the end user, the consumer, the person who's purchasing this, your skill shouldn't be the consideration of the vendor, the person selling it. So I think if it's widely agreed upon that it's a good tea, it should be priced accordingly, regardless of if it's difficult to brew or not. I think dankongs are often a pretty good example of this, where many dankong teas are often quick to go astringent or sour, depending on how you brew them. They do take quite a bit of focus and I would say practice brewing, and you need to brew quite a large number of them because every varietal has a little different take. And if they're true dancong teas, right, truly coming from one bush, then you kind of have to learn based on each individual tea, and you can't really generalize with it. But dankongs are expensive not because they're hard to brew. I think they're expensive because good dankong teas have intrinsic qualities to them that make them good tea, not because they're difficult to brew. Ryan, opposing thoughts? Complete agreement to my thoughts?
No, I don't agree. I don't know. In my experience, I find that the best teas are very dynamic, and gongfu is required to get the most out of them. And it's just one reason why it's so good. It's also very satisfying when you know that there's a range of outcomes. And as a brewer, you know that you're able to make the most out of that tea, and maybe it makes it taste better. Personally, I don't like teas that are super easy to brew, and no matter how you brew it, you're going to get the same outcome. I find it less interesting. I generally find that I get bored of them much more quickly. And that on the high end of aged pu'er, of like gushu, newer pu'er, like really high end longjing, aged oolong, high mountain oolong, really sought after roasted dongding, like competition style. All of it's really hard to brew well. and you have a really dynamic set of outcomes. So, just empirically and anecdotally, it feels like that there seems to be a very strong correlation between how easy or difficult it is to brew with price. And it also is a strange justification of teaware, because we all spend quite a bit of money on high-end teaware, and the goal of that is to accentuate and to take greater control over that brewing process. So the fact that those two are correlated with one another help justify our sunk investments in that teaware.
So I don't think our thoughts are mutually exclusive. I think what you're saying is that, being able to apply skill to a tea and have it have variable outcomes depending on your skill is something that you like. And I agree, it's something I like. I don't like a tea that tastes the same no matter what I do. But I think where we differ here is that I believe it shouldn't impact the price. I think that a good tea should cost what it costs, regardless of if it's, you have to jump through hoops to brew it right or not. Certainly I like dynamic teas as well, but I don't think it means that they should cost more money.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I don't think it 100% needs to be correlated to price. You can certainly have really bad teas with very dynamic outcomes.
This one tea is terrible unless you do these two things, and then it's okay.
Worth $1 per gram.
Price is.
I won't be spending that then.
Price. There's so many things that go into price, like rarity and the amount of man hours that went into making it, and
hashtag authenticity.
Yeah.
Is tea that is hard to make more authentic?
I mean, is tea that's hard to make and tea that's not hard to make, are they both tea? I think both are authentically tea. But, if one truly does take a lot more man hours, then I think something is to be said of that as far as how it impacts the price. If you're having a traditionally processed longjing and someone's hands have been trained for years and years and years to, do all the correct movements during a shotching, and they no longer feel the sensation of their flesh burning because of so many years of practice. I'm willing to pay a little bit more for that than if it just went through basically a tumble dryer.
I know for a fact that you pay more for teas that are harder to make.
Are you going to make a joke? I feel like it didn't finish there.
It wasn't a joke. Well,
once you burn your own hands processing tea, you value the hard work of other people burning their hands to make tea.
So it does sound as though you agree that teas that are harder to make are more authentic. Teas that go through traditional shotching, cast iron wok, teas that go through long roast processes. We've tried teas that have been under 80-hour low and slow hardwoods roasts. Those teas are much harder to make. Do we think of them as more authentic? Do we value them more?
I think that's an artifact of history. It just so happens that the type of mechanization wasn't available, but it also happens that you get better flavor expression with those quote unquote more authentic ways of production.
Well, I think also, Jason, you were referring to one, I think, specific experience we have with a very long roasted oolong tea. And I think a big part of that as well is intention. I think when there's a lot of intent and care put into the process of making a specific tea, of course, that's going to take it to the next level. And not to say that there's, tons of farmers out there that don't care what they're making. I'm sure they do. But there's a difference in intention, I think, when something is, a commodity or even low grade, quote unquote, specialty tea versus some of these, highest of the high, quality teas where the intention of the maker is so extreme to the point of, potentially risking their own health a lot of the time to make these teas as really an expression of I think their own spirit, their path, right, in the world. It's often quite heavily linked with kind of their own thoughts, theory, theology, their own path. So if you want to call that authenticity, I think we can, but I think that might be dumbing it down a little bit. because I think it really comes down to the spirit of the maker, the individual. Maybe we can say it's them being authentically themselves if we want to make it sound very PR.
Yeah, isn't that craft authenticity or idiosyncratic authenticity that we've identified?
I think we just spun ourselves back into the previous chapter. What is good now?
I think so. You talk about individuals imbuing their own spirit, their own thoughts, their own path through. The example that comes to mind, George Washington chops down his father's cherry tree, right? He didn't turn it into charcoal to smoke tea over. But the idea is that individuals, imbued from their own experience, craft teas that move them from artist into artist again. Is that right? That those teas are singular, that those teas are there? I mean, we can have Longjing from different farms that's going to be processed nearly identically. It'll all be identifiable as Longjing. When you have an oolong from some of the more contemporary artistic makers in Taiwan, or certain even pu'ers from individuals in now famous regions and regions that have become famous in Yunnan, those are singular productions. No one is making tea like them. Does that move them into the realm of artists?
I think in many cases, my personal opinion is that it does. If the intention is truly there, I think if it's not done as a way of signaling something special about the marketing, right, of the product, or if it's not a way to sell the product specifically, but it's a way that they, right, as part of their DAO or their path, this is what they've decided to do, and to seek, the highest version of the product that they themselves can make. Yeah, I think it does. And I think it speaks to actually when we think of the levels of practice, right? Structural functionalist versus phenomenology. I think we can take that framework and apply it as well to craftsmanship and crafting of a product. Someone can make a totally, drinkable Longjing that follows all the forms necessary to make a good tasting product. But you might also have someone who achieves the status of an artist, right? Who is making small choices within those processing steps to make the Longjing that they, over many years and years and years, have developed the right experience to make these small sets of choices that truly make them an artist, right? Like they're painting on a canvas and making these small decisions that take this Longjing from a great Longjing to now a phenomenon, right? An experience that can't be replicated by someone else's tea. And I do think that does elevate them to the status of an artist.
And so you're hoping to see the next marketing campaign for the new rare smoked Longjing
with George Washington's cherry tree wood, yes.
George Washington's cherry tree smoked Longjing. If any tea producers or marketers are listening, please do. No need to contact us. The idea is yours. You are free to run with it.
Yeah, we just request at least a couple ounces each.
Well, that is about all of our time for this week's edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Before we close, I would like to thank our listeners. I believe that this will be our longest podcast to date. If you're enjoying this, please leave comments. If you're not enjoying this and you listened this far, please leave comments. We would love to know why. And finally, we would like to give our highest level of thanks to our subscribers at teatechnique.org. You make this show possible. Your contributions, comments, interactions with us give us the energy and the focus and the fortitude to keep going. So thank you, everyone. And please join us again for the discussion of next week's chapter, Classifying the Classifier.
Woo, see y'all then.